Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hi, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm Alice Grundy, the Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press. Peter Dutton eats bleeding heart lefties for breakfast. So begins Lech Blaine's ripping 2024 quarterly essay, Bad Cop, Peter Dutton's Strongman Politics. In this summer book club episode, Lech joined Australia Institute Deputy Director Ebony Bennett to discuss how Peter Dutton rose from Queensland detective to leader of the opposition. It's a story of ambition, race, and power, and is essential reading for understanding both Peter Dutton himself and the evolution of the Liberal Party. This conversation was recorded on April 12, 2024, as part of our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinar series, and some things may have changed since recording. I hope you enjoy the show.
Congratulations on this essay, Lech, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, yeah, look, it's a huge effort, and it always amazes me how people can fit so much into an essay, particularly on a thorny topic like politics where so much happens. But a hugely memorable opening line, Peter Dutton eats bleeding heart lefties for breakfast. What a great place to start the essay. I note he's in the headlines today for a kind of a travel entitlements scandal, and also for making some very controversial comments, likening a protest in Sydney to the Port Arthur massacre. He's no stranger to controversy. Can you tell us a little bit about Peter Dutton, the man, I guess?
Yeah, and so this is something that I trace throughout the essay is how Peter Dutton has kind of built a career around making really inflammatory statements around a number of subjects, but going right back to the start of his career. And so there is, as I say, there's a method to the venom, and I try to peel back behind the kind of greatest hits of Peter Dutton's most controversial statements to show the way that they were driven by internal political requirements at the time, and they've allowed him to sort of climb to the top of the Liberal Party. And I guess the challenge for him now is whether the kind of though that kind of courting controversy has allowed him to entrench himself at the top of the Liberal Party, but whether it will allow him to reach out across the aisle to people who voted for Labor at the last election. And so that's like the great challenge confronting him. And so I just wanted to go right back through his career and then also through his life, because I think that to understand his psychology is quite important, because he's presents as a fairly dull individual, but he's incredibly interesting, and he's incredibly complex. And there's a whole range of social and also personal phenomenon feeding into his political career and also the changes within Australian politics.
Yeah, so I'm just curious to kind of explore some of those formative experiences that kind of shaped him that you do go into. In particular, obviously his time as a Queensland police officer. The title of the essay is Bad Cop. He is kind of the strongman of Australian politics at the moment, taking that kind of pugilistic place of Tony Abbott in the past, I guess. But how much does that background as a police officer inform or has informed his politics from the time he entered Parliament, I guess?
I think, an incredible amount, in the sense that the comparison's often made with Abbott. And Abbott, although they were very close and they share conservative tendencies, Abbott's background was quite different, in the sense that Abbott is from the North Shore of Sydney. He went to a really prestigious private school, then he went to the University of Sydney, then he did a Rhodes Scholarship, then he ended up getting a safe seat on the North Shore in Warringah, which was eventually lost. Whereas Dutton came from a more kind of aspirational background out of suburban Brisbane. He didn't do well at university, left university and became a police officer, and had a number of experiences which were quite traumatic, and he started to open up a bit more about them. And then it was also within this culture of the Queensland police force. Like, the police officers have a pretty strong siege mentality. Queensland police officers have even more of a siege mentality, and this was in the aftermath of the Fitzgerald inquiry, and also at the same time as the results of the Royal Commission into Indigenous deaths in custody was happening. So it was a very kind of the siege mentality that you would have as a young police officer in that environment was huge. And I think that Dutton has kind of attributed his contempt for Paul Keating to high interest rates at the end of the 1980s. But at the same time, Keating, at pretty much roughly the same moment that Dutton was entering the police force and was serving in communities in North Queensland and dealing with lots of cases involving Indigenous people, which he has kind of subsequently attributed as the reason why he didn't attend the apology. Keating was making the Redfern speech, and he was speaking openly about the Great Australian Silence and the way that racism pervaded the treatment of Indigenous communities, including by the police. So I think that Queensland has a very unique political culture, that it's a bit more conservative. It has like a long history of strongman and even strong women leaders. But then when you add those experiences, when you add personal trauma, when you add the emergence of someone like Pauline Hanson, who was kind of speaking to a lot of those issues, and then Dutton was in the middle of all of that, and I think it explains the level of his contempt for progressives.
Yeah, and that's obviously a theme that carries throughout the essay, and the contempt kind of shows up in a few different ways. There's obviously, like the tweet that anyone who's in or pays attention to politics will know about, you dirty lefties are too easy, or whatever that one was. Then you've got you talk about some of the contempt for the judiciary, and through that lens of, his experiences with the police force, I guess, and that strong theme throughout his political career of law and order, and kind of scapegoating marginalized communities and blaming them for violence and things like that as a political opportunist, like an opportunity. And I guess I just wanted to draw some of those parallels. You were talking about he is often compared to Tony Abbott, but you kind of talk a little bit about the fact that Abbott was far more ideologically driven, and that Peter Dutton is perhaps more practical, but also has this very keen sense of the suburbs and attuned to what suburban people care about. Do you think that kind of sense that he has, will get him through this next electoral period? Obviously, it's been successful for him in the past, but the electoral math has changed quite a bit there. How much is that sense of suburbia going to be important to his role as an opposition leader, I guess?
Yeah, well, he flagged it in his first speech, and there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of the suburban strategy, and there is an element of opportunity there for the Liberal Party. There is disillusionment during a cost of living crisis in outer suburban communities that feel like that they're disconnected from the political system. I think the issue for Dutton is that he's appealing to an idea of suburbia which carries more weight, say, in the northern suburbs of Brisbane, which aren't particularly ethnically diverse. And it's an idea of suburbia that hasn't changed that much since Howard was winning elections with outer suburban seats, or also regional seats. And that's those old Howard Battler seats. And there's this idea, and Tony Abbott's someone who has spoken about it, that the Liberal Party should just forget about the seats lost to the Teals, and that their new electoral base is the outer suburbs. And he cites the seat of Lindsay, which is based around Penrith. And that was one of those Howard Battler seats. But if you look at a lot of those other Howard Battler seats, like Macquarie, like Macarthur, like Parramatta, the Central Coast seats, there's a couple there, that they were kind of like those pivotal Howard Battler seats. They've all gone back to Labor. So I think that the idea that those demographics provides like an equal kind of electoral base for the Liberal Party is what Wentworth and Kooyong and those other blue chip Liberal seats. I think it's it's certainly ambitious. And I also think that if you look at a lot of those other outer suburban seats in Sydney and Melbourne, they're very ethnically diverse. There's lots of them are very ethnically diverse, and Dutton himself, but also the Liberal Party, just haven't really made any tangible attempts to connect with them. So I think that there actually would be political opportunities there for a conservative political movement, but the Liberal Party still looks and sounds like the Liberal Party of 2001, but Australia itself and the suburbs as well have changed a lot since Howard was winning those elections and those seats.
Yeah, and I want to, I guess, explore a little bit more, perhaps some of those chickens coming home to roost for Dutton now that his challenge is picking up some of those seats in order to win government, if they are indeed going to concede those teal kind of seats. And as I kind of referenced before, some of those marginalised communities that he has really gone for as part of either a law and order strategy or just red meat for the base kind of thing. We've got comments like the African gangs in Melbourne, the comments around, that it was a mistake to let in Lebanese Muslims into the country in the 70s. There's a whole litany of those kinds of comments that, as you say, might work for some elements of the Liberal Party base, or for indeed winning kind of more votes back from One Nation and more conservative members of the electorate. But is he really going to have to reckon with those contradictions, or that will be really difficult if that's the path that they're going to pursue at this election? How much of that is going to be a millstone around his neck with those kinds of voters in those kinds of seats?
Well, the thing I would say is that when you interview kind of disengaged voters and even voters who are relatively loyal to the LNP in Queensland, one thing that sticks out is that people don't really know that much about Dutton. So there are there will be issues for him closer to the election when Labor are kind of like targeting specific audiences and communities and replaying those moments. So, but I think that even with the disengaged voters, I think the issue for Dutton is more that the fact that he constantly engages in these kinds of cultural war issues, and I think it conveys, even for people who might sympathise with his views on those issues, it conveys like a lack of seriousness about large scale economic debates, and that's a difference, I think, to someone like Howard, who definitely profited from divisive debates around race, but it was always underpinned by he was able to articulate, even if you didn't agree with it, a really clear economic vision for Australia. I think even disengaged voters realise that Howard was someone who knew what he was talking about when he was talking about economics. And that's because he was using those other issues to pursue economic reform. That was the main game for him. He was someone who deeply understood Australia's economy and was able to show that, I think, even in debates where he was with hostile audiences. I don't think Dutton does that. I don't think he has the same level of gravitas on economics as what Howard and Costello did. And I think the constant, we saw it at the start of the year, whenever the opportunity arises for like a debate about economic reform, he retreats really quickly into these culture war issues and going back over retreading debates around the voice. And a lot of the people that he's appealing to with that, one of the reasons that they tuned out during the voice is because of the divisive nature of the debate. But he's sort of giving them more and more of that divisiveness. So I think that becomes like a self-defeating cycle, even though it might provide short-term political wins in situations like the voice referendum. Even people who are relatively disengaged from politics, I don't think that he's presenting himself as kind of like someone who's going to be able to address the really serious economic issues facing Australia.
Yeah, we kind of saw him struggle a bit with the response to the government's decision to change the stage 3 tax cuts. And yeah, you kind of talk a little bit about that in here, that there was a fairly consistent message all the way up until the point that, the government decided to make those changes. And then after a few kind of protests, it all just went dead and he just agreed to it. Didn't really have much of an alternative there to talk about. But I do want to kind of talk about him within the Liberal Party and some of the changes that you explore in the essay about, I guess, all the turmoil of leadership and some of those internal struggles that the Liberal Party is facing with a whole bunch of the moderates kind of not being elected at the last election. And I was really curious to read so many. I'd kind of forgotten about George Brandis being kind of his factional opponent over the years. There's lots of great quotes from him in here. But where does Dutton sit within that Liberal Party, I guess, leadership tussle and the kind of Liberal Party that we see today after that last election in terms of all those leadership changes that we had, particularly around that Turnbull era? What were some of the things that stood out to you from that period with Dutton's behaviour?
I think when you talk to his like factional opponents within the Liberal Party, there is an awareness that they see Dutton as kind of like a mainstream conservative, more in the lineage of John Howard. They don't necessarily see him as like a complete fringe figure. So I think that he is someone, and that was one of the really interesting things that Brandis said, was that he actually finds Dutton more ambitious than Tony Abbott. And Tony Abbott is one of the most notoriously ambitious politicians like in modern Australian history. Like he famously either wanted to be Prime Minister or the Pope from quite a young age. So the fact that he saw Dutton as more ambitious and more driven to be the Prime Minister from the moment that he entered Parliament was kind of really telling. And there was this constant, and it's been like talked a lot about with Dutton, and previous profiles have spoken about the way that his private behaviour doesn't really mesh with his public persona. And I thought that was interesting. Like, I don't think that excuses his, the implications of some of his actions and some of the issues and communities that he's targeted. But I found that kind of interesting because it showed that in private, he's seen as like being a really kind of cautious, shy, not someone that's constantly beating the desk and shouting at people. Or he's seen as like kind of risk averse and being across everything. And then, at particular moments in his political career, he has came out and made really incendiary kind of comments. So it's kind of a contradiction. And I think it goes to this idea that he is quite someone who's quite in control of what he's doing. And whether you agree with his actions or not, he sees those actions as being his path to being the Prime Minister, which is a really single-minded ambition of his. And then within the broader lineage of the Liberal Party, he's really interesting because I think he is the first Liberal leader who probably really comes from that Howard Battler lineage, and a lot of them have subsequent to Howard have spoken about the Battlers and certainly targeted them. But Dutton, his dad was a bricklayer, became a builder, was sort of a proto Howard Battler in a way. And Dutton kind of bristles against the signifiers of elitism that were historically associated with the Liberal Party. Like the Liberal Party was seen as a party of lawyers and doctors, and Dutton is someone who's made a career from beating up on lawyers, and he doesn't tie himself to those kind of signifiers, and so he kind of encapsulates the changes in the Liberal Party that we've certainly seen since someone like Robert Menzies, who was kind of proudly quite pompous and really regularly demonstrated his higher intelligence, and the Liberal Party has it hasn't happened overnight, but it's changed over time, and then we arrive at this moment with someone like Dutton, and he seems to I'm not sure whether he can put the genie back in the bottle and appeal to some of the kind of moral middle class voters that have been lost from the Liberal Party.
I was also really interested, I guess, in, as you said, that he doesn't identify with those elements of the Liberal Party, and there is that very strong anti-elite kind of message and anti-inner city latte sipping lefties kind of rhetoric. He describes himself as not a career politician, but I was really interested in how early on in his life he did run for Parliament, even if he wasn't successful, and some of the other things that people might not necessarily know about him. So Scott Morrison obviously did a good job of rebranding himself as like the daggy dad. Peter Dutton is, anti-elites, but also, has a multi-million-dollar property portfolio. I think in here you talk about that his wife bought a shopping centre that he forgot to declare because obviously you just forget about things like that. There's some real contradictions there, I guess.
Yeah. So, and this is I would also say an extension to that Howard Battler discourse. Another reason that he encapsulates that so well is that a lot of so-called Howard Battlers became incredibly wealthy, and a large part of that was due to the changes that John Howard made in terms of the loopholes around negative gearing and capital gains. So Dutton, while presenting as like anti-elite, he's a incredibly wealthy. He's been in politics for a long time now. He ran for state parliament when he was 19. He's got really strong political aspirations dating back to before he was a police officer, before his experiences in the police force. So there is that contradiction, and kind of it goes to this broader debate within Australian politics now, where anyone with a slightly progressive perspective is painted as an elite, often by people who with coming from positions of incredible wealth and power. And so it becomes, it's very hard to ever have a proper debate or conversation about anything, because and you get to this point where, like we saw during the Voice debate, anyone who was pro-voice, including Indigenous activists who had come from incredibly humble means, were suddenly all painted as like inner city elites. And it kind of, I think it really poisoned the nature of the debate, because I think it's one thing to have, questions or critiques about certain policies or positions, but to simply just dismiss people out of hand as being part of this kind of like conspiracy of elites and putting them in the same bracket as Alan Joyce, for example, it just doesn't lead to any kind of quality of public debate.
I'm also really interested in some of the elements that you talked about in terms of, his experiences in Parliament, not only in going for the leadership, but kind of how he has wielded power. And there's two things I want to kind of talk about. You have a quote in here, or like you've said in the essay, for John Howard, punishment was a means to power, and for Dutton, power is a means to punishment. And I guess I kind of want to link that to some of the things that you talked about in terms of the power that he concentrated in Home Affairs and some of those controversial programs and things that he was responsible for as minister.
Yeah, and I think that the distinction there I made was sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about Howard was someone with who was driven into politics by a very kind of like single-minded economic vision, and I think that he, while having certainly socially conservative views, he was more of an opportunist around, say, asylum seekers. It's an issue that presented itself, and he used it to further his own economic vision for the country. Whereas I think because of Dutton's experiences throughout the 90s, he entered politics not as someone with a really single-minded economic vision for the country, but he was really driven by the fact that he thought that too many criminals were getting weak sentences, and he wanted to be in politics to provide the perspective of a police officer, and that's like an explicit reason for why he entered politics. So there is this sense of like crime and punishment, which I think is a lot bigger deal for Dutton than it was for John Howard, even if John Howard exploited those debates and conversations. And then when you have someone like that rising through power, who doesn't have any fear, and in fact actually thrives on punishment because it provokes a response from progressives and from the people that he sees as social justice warriors in terms of refugee advocates. He sort of thrives on that kind of conflict, and it allows him to rise to this position. And then we've all seen over the past few years, it's kind of been like a steady stream of revelations about what was actually happening in Home Affairs. And so it's not just a moral argument about what are we doing to these people on islands off the coast of Australia. It's also about his ability to administer programs, which is a primary job of politicians. And there's not really any evidence at all that he was good at the introduction of programs or the management of programs. And in fact, when you see what he was doing at the same time as running Home Affairs, you get you get a picture that he was much more preoccupied with how he was going to climb to the top of the Liberal Party, and that he was quite good at he was very good, in fact, at that internal politics and the kind of cultivation of connections with conservative commentators and power brokers, but not very good at what he was claiming, which was that he was protecting Australia, and that we, in fact, while we had this single-minded vision on stopping the boats, we had all sorts of issues around the kinds of people who were coming into Australia and people who were being mistreated, vulnerable people who were being mistreated because there wasn't the kind of oversight that was needed. So there was this kind of tunnel vision on punishment rather than the actual like running a productive and effective immigration program.
And I was really interested to read about some of the things that he did in Home Affairs, including the proposed stripping of citizenship from terrorism suspects, not just terrorists, but just suspects, that you kind of talk about that even Barnaby Joyce was kind of gobsmacked by that proposal and being controversial. But it does.
There was actually quite a few moments. I was going to say there was actually quite a few moments throughout my research, and I had to cut a few of them, where Barnaby Joyce was like going right back to the start of Dutton's career, where Barnaby Joyce would often be kind of like a voice of reason, whether it was like cutting entitlements for single mothers. And yeah, there was a few times where Dutton was going really hard on these issues, and Barnaby Joyce was actually the voice of reason, saying, "Oh, that's a bit hectic, isn't it?" Like, yeah. So it's that I think that says something about how kind of like gung ho Dutton was on a bunch of those issues.
And I guess during all of those leadership tensions, another thing that kind of, I mean, obviously he's opposition leader now, but that came out, he was really good at doing some of that internal politics. But in the end, it wasn't enough to get him over the line when Scott Morrison became leader. So, he famously couldn't do the numbers and didn't get that position when Scott Morrison went on to become the leader.
Yeah.
but he's set up there now. Looking ahead, how do you think it's looking for him going into the next election? What are some of the key challenges going to be for him?
Yeah, like there's extreme challenges, like in terms of the structural issues facing the Liberal Party, and how do you? And this goes to the suburban strategy, because one of the reasons why it's kind of like a tantalising idea or thesis is because it will be extremely hard for the Liberal Party to appeal to seats that they lost to the Teals, and also to outer suburban, sort of more socially conservative seats and regional seats. It's a very hard thing to walk both those lines in a single election, and I think that's why we've seen the Liberal Party kind of prioritise those more outer suburban regional seats. But yeah, it's very hard to see them getting a majority at the next election, which is why I think a lot of analysts have kind of opined that he is pursuing kind of like a two-term strategy, that the main game is to drive Labor into minority government at the next election, and then to keep cultivating a sense of chaos, and then coming up at that second election and winning it. And I think, I don't write off the kind of certain political skills that Dutton has. Like I kind of look at them in the essay, and I don't think I underestimate him as a politician. But yeah, it's incredibly, the comparison would be made again with Abbott driving Gillard into minority government and then beating Rudd at the 2013 election. But Abbott became opposition leader at the end of 2009, so he didn't serve a full 6 years as opposition leader. It would be, I think that the last opposition leader who served 2 full terms might have actually been Whitlam. Like in terms of like consecutively, like I think it's not really the done thing anymore. Like it used to be, you would serve an apprenticeship as an opposition leader and then eventually possibly become Prime Minister. In more recent history, they're often quite recent. Like if you look at Rudd, for example, he became opposition leader, I think, like roughly a year before he became Prime Minister. So it would be a colossal task for him to win in a single term. And then even if he was able to drive Labor into minority government, it would be a colossal ask for him to last until the following election after that. So I think it's like a really, objectively speaking, really challenging to see a path to power for him. But that doesn't mean, and I think that's the other thing that the essay does, is that it says, like, don't underestimate Dutton as a politician, and also that he doesn't need to become the Prime Minister to have like a really tangible effect on Australian politics and on the kind of debates that we're having, and on he doesn't need to win the next election to have like a really serious impact. And to keep Australian politics stuck in a place where it's probably been for, 25, 26 years, like him being the opposition leader, and in some ways on certain issues being a quite effective opposition leader, will keep Australia stuck in a previous epoch.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Follow the Money. If you want to join our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinars live, you can sign up via our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or follow the link in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcast@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Blue Sky at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget, you can order your copy of the first book from Australia Institute Press today. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Amy Ramikis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. You can order it now via our website. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Alice Grundy. Thanks for listening.